In the 1950s, archaeologists excavating a site on the coast of Chile found something that didn't belong. Chicken bones, pre-Columbian, dated centuries before Columbus. But the origin was wrong. They weren't European. They weren't native South American. Decades later, when DNA analysis became possible, the answer came back Polynesian. The chickens had come from islands 4,000 miles away, across an ocean that Europeans needed three-masted ships to survive, and they arrived before Columbus. By 2007, the genetic confirmation was published. Polynesians had reached the coast of South America in wooden boats, with sails shaped like a shark fin. But nobody explains why they became that good, why a single language family came to occupy half the Earth's circumference, and what kind of pressure turns coastal fishermen into the greatest navigators in human history. This isn't a story about adventure. It's about what happens when the ocean starts taking your land and doesn't stop. Before we can talk about the Austronesians, we need to talk about who was already there. 60,000 years ago, the world's ocean levels were dramatically lower than today. Sea levels during the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 BCE, sat roughly 400 feet below where they stand now. That exposed land. Lots of it. A vast landmass called Sundaland connected what we now call mainland Southeast Asia to Sumatra, Java, and Borneo. To the east, the continent of Sahul joined Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania into a single territory, and across the narrow straits between them, people crossed. We don't know exactly how. The archaeological record from 60,000 years ago is incomplete, but we know they made it because the descendants are still there. Aboriginal Australians, Tasmanians, Papuan peoples, Southeast Asian Negrito populations. These were not primitive wanderers stumbling through an empty world. They were the first solution to the same problem that would define the Pacific for the next 50 millennia. How do you live on a planet that keeps changing its coastline? They answered it with deep ecological knowledge, multi-generational adaptation, and social structures built for survival across discontinuous terrain. By 8000 BCE, when sea levels had risen substantially and the land connections were gone, these populations had been living in the Pacific for tens of thousands of years. They were already home. The Austronesian expansion, which comes next, did not happen in empty ocean. It happened in a world already occupied, already adapted, already ancient. That distinction matters because it changes what the Austronesian achievement actually was. They didn't pioneer the Pacific. They extended it. Fast forward to around 5,000 years ago. In Taiwan and across the coastal regions of what is now the Philippines and islands Southeast Asia, a distinct population had developed something rare: institutional stability. These were the Proto-Austronesians. They spoke a common ancestral language. They had pottery, functional, decorated, systematic. They had agriculture, taro, yam, breadfruit, banana. They had livestock, pigs, chickens, dogs. They had trade routes, villages with memory, ways of passing knowledge down. They were not sailors, not yet. They were coastal and riverine people, fishermen, farmers, traders operating in the sheltered zones between land and open water. But the sea that bordered their world was not stable. Sea levels had been rising since the end of the last ice age, slowly, over centuries, with no single catastrophic moment. The change was gradual enough that no generation could fully perceive it. But across generations, it was undeniable. The fishing grounds your grandfather knew, gone. The delta, where your village was founded, narrowing, salinizing, flooding. The river mouth that fed your trade network, shifting. they didn't choose to become ocean people. The ocean came to them first. Around 3,500 BCE, something shifted. Instead of retreating inland, instead of becoming mountain people, valley farmers, leaving the coast behind, Proto-Austronesian communities made the opposite choice. They built toward the water, the triangular sail. You've seen it, asymmetrical, angled, sharp at the top. It looks simple. It isn't. Columbus used square sails. They worked downwind. You followed wherever the wind was going. The triangular sail, properly rigged, lets you sail against the wind. It lets you control your heading rather than surrender to the weather. That's not a detail. That's the difference between exploration and a one-way trip. If you can't sail back, you're not exploring, you're fleeing. The outrigger canoe. European shipbuilders solved the stability problem by making boats wide and heavy, slow but upright. The Austronesian solution was the opposite. Narrow hulls for speed with a stabilizing float, the outrigger, extending off to one side on a rigid arm. On Pacific swells that would capsize a European longship, an outrigger hull simply lifts and settles. It doesn't fight the ocean. It moves with it. And here's what makes this remarkable. From Madagascar, off the coast of Africa, to Easter Island in the eastern Pacific, a distance of nearly 12,000 miles, these boats are structurally identical. Not similar. Not evolved from a common ancestor in ways that are detectable, but distinct. Identical. Not because they copied each other after the expansion, but because they all remembered the original design, and the conditions of the Pacific Ocean meant there was no better solution to find: navigation. This is where Western accounts consistently fail. They call traditional Pacific navigation wayfinding, as if it were instinct, as if people looked at the stars and just knew. It wasn't instinct. It was a formal education system. Master navigators trained apprentices over 10 to 15 years. The curriculum included rising and setting points of hundreds of stars across all seasons. Ocean swell patterns. Different island chains generate distinct swells that travel hundreds of miles and can be read through the hull of a canoe. Bird species that fly toward land at specific times. Cloud formations that form over islands too distant to see. Water temperature and color changes that signal depth, shifts, and currents. Some apprentices would lie in the hull of the canoe during training, not watching, but feeling. Learning the ocean through wood and skin. This was not technology. It was institutional memory, encoded in people, passed through generations with the precision of a curriculum. Now apply that system to a dispersal forced by rising water. From Taiwan, they moved south into the Philippines and Indonesia, absorbing and trading with Austroasiatic peoples already there. Some groups moved west into the Indian Ocean trade routes. Others pressed east into near Oceania, the Bismarck Archipelago, the Solomon Islands. The Lapita culture, named for an archaeological site in New Caledonia, left their signature across thousands of miles, pottery stamped with geometric patterns using carved shell tools. Nearly identical designs separated by 2,000 miles of open ocean, made within centuries of each other. That's not coincidence. That's contact. It means someone sailed there and sailed back. By 1000 BCE, communities had reached Fiji, Tonga, Samoa. By 300 CE, the Marquesas. By 400 CE, Hawaii. By 700 CE, Madagascar, 4,000 miles west across the Indian Ocean. By 1200 CE, New Zealand, the southernmost reach of the expansion. And at some point, we still debate exactly when, the coast of South America. Let's talk about the proof, because this is where the story gets uncomfortable Not because the evidence is uncertain, but because of how long it was denied. Language, Malagasy, the language of Madagascar, shares its closest linguistic relatives with the Manyan language of southeast Borneo. Not neighboring languages, not distant cousins, core vocabulary, structural grammar, the kind of similarity that indicates shared origin, not coincidental drift. Borneo and Madagascar are 4,000 miles apart, separated by the Indian Ocean. There is no explanation for this other than deliberate, sustained maritime contact. Tattoos, Polynesian, Maori, Filipino, and Taiwanese. Indigenous tattooing traditions share geometric patterns and body placement that are too specific to be coincidental. But this wasn't aesthetics. In many Austronesian cultures, tattoos encoded identity, lineage, rank, voyage record, rites of passage. If you were found shipwrecked by strangers, your tattoos told them who you were. It was a distributed identification system, written on skin, that survived ocean crossings because it was worn by the people making them. Oral traditions. Every major Austronesian culture has flood narratives, recorded before European contact, indigenous in structure, not borrowed from missionaries, ancestors fleeing rising water, voyages to new lands. The ocean is both destroyer and home. These aren't metaphors dressed up as history. They're history dressed up as myth because that's how you preserve it across generations without writing. The food. In 2007, geneticist Alice Story and colleagues published DNA analysis confirming what the bones had suggested for decades. Chickens found at the El Arenal 1 site in Chile were of Polynesian genetic origin. Chickens can't swim 4,000 miles. They don't survive on driftwood. Someone put them on a boat. Someone sailed them there. And based on the dating, that happened before 1300 CE, before Columbus, before any documented European contact with the Pacific coast of South America. Then there's the kumara, the sweet potato, native to South America, present in Polynesia, with a Polynesian name derived from the Quechua word for the same plant, not a South American name transliterated. A Polynesian adaptation of a word from a language spoken only on the continent they weren't supposed to have reached. For decades, mainstream scholarship resisted the conclusion. They proposed parallel domestication that Pacific Islanders independently discovered and cultivated a South American root crop without contact. They suggested ocean currents carried the seeds. The DNA doesn't support either hypothesis. What it supports is straightforward. Polynesians reached South America, established contact significant enough to exchange crops and linguistic vocabulary, and returned. The resistance to this conclusion is itself the story. Accepting it means accepting that indigenous Pacific peoples had transoceanic navigational capability equal to or exceeding European explorers, without steel, without written charts, without compasses. And that the age of exploration was not the first time humans deliberately crossed oceans. It was the first time Europeans did. Here's what we don't talk about: the voyages that didn't arrive. For every successful settlement, Hawaii, New Zealand, Madagascar, the Marquesas, there were boats that sailed into the open Pacific and vanished. No archaeological record, no oral tradition of arrival, just absence. Oral histories across the Pacific preserve these losses. Not as failures, as part of the accounting. The canoes that didn't return. Women and children sailed too. These weren't scouting missions. They were commitments. Entire family units, grandparents, infants, the people who carry the agricultural knowledge, the women who hold the matrilineal lineage, loaded into wooden boats and pushed off from the last land they knew. Because staying meant watching the water keep rising, and sailing meant a chance. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, settled around 1200 CE, the most isolated inhabited island on Earth, 2,000 miles from the nearest populated land in any direction. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, the population had crashed. The forests were stripped. The famous moai stood abandoned. Many toppled. Western accounts presented this as a cautionary tale of primitive self-destruction. They missed the point. They got there, in wooden boats, across 2,000 miles of open water, with no intermediate landmarks, no islands to recalibrate by, no margin for navigational error. They loaded the boat with chickens, rats, sweet potatoes, taro cuttings, breadfruit. They didn't just survive the voyage, they planned to stay. And they did, for centuries. The collapse wasn't ignorance, it was isolation. Rapa Nui had trees when they arrived. Not many, and not the right species for large canoe construction. They used what was there, for moving the moai, for building homes, for fuel. By the time the mathematics of their situation became clear, that they needed boats to leave and trees to build boats, the trees were gone. They were so good at reaching remote islands that they reached one they couldn't escape. That's not a failure of intelligence. That's the outer limit of a system built for traversal, not for permanent resource management on a rock in the middle of nowhere. Every system has a failure mode. For the Austronesian maritime system, Easter Island was it. Here's what we got wrong. In the 19th century, a French navigator named Dumont d'Urville sailed through the Pacific and classified what he saw: Polynesia to the east, Melanesia in the southwest, Micronesia in the northwest. Convenient geographic boxes based partly on location, partly on skin color, partly on what Europeans could easily observe from a ship deck. Modern anthropology has largely moved past these categories. They were interaction spheres, not ancestry groups. The Pacific was not the mosaic of distinct isolated cultures d'Urville mapped. It was a network. But even today, when we look at Pacific cultures and see different languages, different tattoo systems, different boat designs, different oral traditions, we tend to call it cultural drift, as if they forgot where they came from. They didn't forget. They adapted. Polynesians became long-distance deep ocean voyagers because the territories they settled were separated by hundreds and thousands of miles of open water. Micronesians became atoll specialists, masters of survival on islands barely above sea level, with sophisticated storm prediction and inter-island communication networks. Melanesians built dense trade networks across short distances because they lived in clustered archipelagos where cooperation was the survival mechanism. The Malagasy crossed the Indian Ocean and integrated into the East African coastal trade system because the monsoon winds made the route viable and their homeland options had narrowed. Different surfaces, same underlying architecture. The boats, the triangular sails, the navigation system, the pottery tradition, the tattooing practices, the oral memory structures, the flood narratives. All of it persisted, modified for local conditions but structurally continuous, across 12,000 miles and 4,000 years. That's not drift. That's what systems theorists would now call anti-fragility. A system that doesn't just survive pressure, it improves because of it. Stress tests the components. Only the functional adaptations survive. The result is a distributed network more resilient than any of its individual nodes. They touch 3 continents: Asia, Africa, South America. They occupied 50% of the Earth's longitudinal span. And the mechanism was not ambition, not empire, not conquest. It was a survival system built by people whose land kept disappearing that turned the very thing taking their world, the ocean, into the infrastructure of their civilization, when European ships arrived in the Pacific in force beginning in the 16th century, systematically by the 18th, they didn't see what we've described. They saw islanders without writing, without metal, without cities. By the metrics Europeans used to evaluate civilization, they registered 0. What they couldn't see, what their framework had no category for, was the institutional architecture, the multi-generational navigation education system, the oral libraries encoding 3,000 years of voyaging routes, the distributed knowledge networks that had kept a civilization coherent across an area no empire had ever spanned. Colonial governments banned traditional navigation. Missionaries collected and burned oral histories. Disease killed the people who held the knowledge before it could be recorded. By the time Western scholars started asking the right questions, starting with Thor Heyerdahl's provocative, if flawed, Kon-Tiki expedition in 1947, continuing through the DNA studies of the 2000s, the genetic work of the 2010s, much of what had been known was gone. We'll never fully reconstruct it. But here's what we know. The Austronesian expansion is the most successful multi-generational maritime project in human history. It lasted 4,000 years. It covered half the Earth. It maintained institutional coherence across distances that should have erased any memory of shared origin. And it began not with ambition, but because the water kept rising and they refused to drown. If you want to understand what humans are capable of under sustained pressure, not a crisis, not a war, but a slow generational forcing that never relents, don't look at empires. Look at the people who built an entire civilization inside the problem. Because the ocean took their land, so they took the ocean.